Previously, I shared a series on how to use the Tesla API to get data from cars, other products like solar and Powerwall. And some of that, if you watch that series, I put into Google Sheets. And the reason I did that was for easier manipulation and doing calculations, which was much easier in a spreadsheet. And other items I put into in a database, in this case, one called InfluxDB. And I use this thing called Grafana to visualize that. And the reason I chose to do that is because there's so much data. It's time series data, which means every 5 minutes or every few seconds, in some cases, there's data to store. So that's better suited for a database and a visualization tool like Grafana. So what I didn't do is show how I set the charts up in the database part. So I'll do that in this video in a step-by-step fashion. And so, quickly, what's Grafana, right? So it's an amazing tool, for visualizing data. There's like different versions of it for, commercial use or whatever, but there is a free version for now, and it's, it has some basic capabilities, which I think are pretty useful and powerful just by itself, right? So you can see here, this is my actual Tesla Powerwall and solar information. A lot of this you see from the other videos. It's very similar to what you'd get from the mobile app, and so I've recreated it by storing the data here, right? So I'll show you how I created this, how I stored the data, and how I created this. So first, you have to get all the right software. I use a Raspberry Pi to do that, and first thing you have to do is you have to get the operating system. You can go to raspberrypi.com, go to the software section. And then they have an imager you can download, which is pretty good. I happen to already have one, so I won't download that again. And then you can go here, and I choose, in this particular application, I choose the 64-bit operating system, the light version, not the desktop version. So, why 64-bit? It's because the InfluxDB, which is the one that's specialized for time series and IoT kind of data, there's defects on the 32-bit version, and they're going to deprecate that, and I think it's going to be end of life or end of support life. So that's why I'm choosing to use the version that's on 64-bit, and why light? Because I like to run my Raspberry Pi and this application headless, which means without an attached monitor, keyboard, mouse, right? So that means I don't really need all the additional software that you would need to run the desktop version, and then I just SSH into the Raspberry Pi from my laptop or some other place using a terminal app, right? Of course, you can obviously do this on your Windows or Mac desktop or laptop, but depending on the thing you're doing with this application, you don't really need that much power to warrant paying for a full laptop or desktop. And I think it's better to isolate it into something inexpensive like a Raspberry Pi that you could dedicate to running this, because if you run a laptop, you're doing other stuff, video editing, it could really, degrade the performance, or you have to do upgrades. It's just, in some cases, because it just runs automatically, I like to keep it separate. So that's why I chose it set up in a Raspberry Pi and run it headless. So if you go to install the operating system, you go to the Raspberry Pi.org here, then you can go to computer software, and I used to use a different imager, but the newest operating system for Raspberry Pi, that they have a little bit more complicated installation, which if you use their own imager, it makes it a lot easier. And I'll show you what I mean, because before, all the configurations for like Wi-Fi, especially for headless setup, right? I think with desktop setups it's easier because you have user interface, but for headless setup it's much more difficult. You had to write in text files to make it start up properly for you to log in and get access. But with Bullseye, or the latest version of Raspberry Pi OS, for example, there's not a default user, so you have to create that. So all those sort of things, which we'll go over in a second, is actually quite easy now if you use the Raspberry Pi installer, the imager, and in fact, even you don't have to download the operating system, you can just choose it. So now I'm in the Raspberry Pi imager, and I'm going to choose the operating system I want to install. As I mentioned, you want to use the 64-bit, and I use the light version. And then I'm going to choose a storage. In this case, I'm going to pick my SD card here. I have a 32 gigabyte one. You probably need a bigger one, but you can get by with this if you're not storing a lot of data. In our case, you will be, so you probably be better off with the 64 or 128 gig. And then the setup part, this is the one I'm talking about. So this is where you can do what used to be more manual, or in some cases now it's even more difficult because they changed the way the operating system works. So I can set the host name, which for now default to Raspberry Pi. I want to enable SSH so I can log into it from a different machine, which is why I chose headless. Use password authentication, and then here I'm going to use what used to be the default Pi username. You could pick any one now, but I just use the same one, and I'll pick the same password, which was default. You should pick a different one. And then you can configure, if you're going to hardwire, you don't need to do wireless. In my case, I'm going to set up my wireless LAN, and it copies it from your desktop configuration here. So after you pick the right SSID for your wireless, and you enter the password for that, you want to put the correct country. In my case, it's US. Pick locale settings. Again, this used to be, you could do it after the fact, but it's nice that they have it available in the imager right off the bat. So I'm here in the western region of the United States, so that works. And these don't really matter, but you could do that to basically eject it when you're done. I don't know what the telemetry is, frankly. And then so we'll save it, and then hit write, and then it'll image the operating system. Okay, now it's done. You can remove the SD card, insert it into Raspberry Pi, and then boot it up. So now that you've inserted the SD card into the Raspberry Pi and booted it up, the first time it takes a couple of minutes, so because it has to do all the initial config after that. Anytime you boot or reboot, it's pretty quick. So you can SSH into now. If you did all the setup correct, it should work. So use SSH pi res local. So this is the host name I had set up previously. And since it's the first time, it's making sure I want to connect to this. Okay, password is what you had set up before. Okay, there you go. So that's a good sign. You get a prompt. Everything is already set up in your Raspberry Pi here. And then so there's one thing that I also do. It doesn't seem to be done in the initial configuration. I don't really know if it's important or not, but I seem to do it. It seems to be described in a lot of different places. Is this option to expand the file system? So I don't know if it's required or not, but you use this configurator called rasp-config. It's headless. Go down to advanced options, expand file system. Okay, and then you have to reboot it. Okay, should have finished rebooting by now. Okay, so we're in, and the first thing you want to do is update the operating system and any of the packages it has. You want to check that. You run these two commands. We'll reach out and check to see if there's some patches it's got to do. So there are some, so that's fine. Do that. You want to run this before you install anything to make sure you have the latest of everything. It generally doesn't take too long. There we go. And we're going to first install InfluxDB. And I'll put a link into the sort of step-by-step instructions that I used. So I'm just copying and pasting from the step-by-step instructions. So you could see that typing it would be difficult. So you can just follow along. So first thing you got to do is add this InfluxDB repository key to our installation here. Okay, and then the next thing is for the Raspberry Pi OS, we have to get a repository key installed. And you can see down here that it echoed back Bullseye, which is the actual operating system we're on, so that's a good sign. And then we're going to run the update one more time to make sure we don't have any packages we need to update as a result of InfluxDB. Okay, that's good. And then now we're going to go ahead and install InfluxDB. Okay, so that's pretty quick. There's a couple more commands you want to run so that you could run this as a service. That way, if you reboot the Raspberry Pi or whatever reason, it'll always start up by default. It's like having the startup, adding it to the startup queue for the Windows machines. So this is the same thing. System controller. Again, don't worry about keeping up with the typing. I'll put a link to the step-by-step guide so you don't have to try to keep up here. Okay, and then so those things are going to enable that service to be added there, and then we're going to start it. You only have to do this once because after this it'll just start up automatically unless you shut it down. Okay, and we can check it by looking at the status. You see it's active and running, so that's good. We can log in and look around, but frankly there's nothing in there right now, so we'll just go right on to the next step, which is getting Grafana installed. We want to add the key just like we did for the repository key, just like we did for InfluxDB. We're going to do that for Grafana, and then we're going to run these extra commands. Okay, so now we could check for update. Sorry about that. Okay, so everything's good to go there. Now we'll install it. Okay, similar to InfluxDB, we're going to make sure that this can run automatically on startup. All this will be in the step-by-step instructions. Okay, now we can start it. Okay, check that it's running. Okay, this is active running, so we're good. And we'll do a quick check on the web page to make sure that that's running. Okay, so now if you open up a browser and type in your server name on Raspberry Pi.local, go to port 3000, you'll see the Grafana thing come up. Default username admin, default password, if you want to change, it's admin. Skip this part for now, but you should change your password. So looking on your Raspberry Pi, this is up and running, right? Obviously there's nothing in here right now, but we'll make sure we populate it